The morning sun barely kissed the palace walls when a whisper cut through the gilded halls like a blade. "She isn't who we thought she was." The words weren't spoken aloud, not yet, but they hung in the air, drifting through corridors lined with centuries of secrets, echoing off the portraits of monarchs long dead. The palace had weathered revolutions, wars, betrayals, and scandals. But nothing had prepared it for this. Nothing could. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. For weeks, the corridors had been buzzing with rumors. Courtiers exchanged glances, their whispers soft, yet charged with tension. They spoke in half-sentences and cryptic gestures, passing rumors that were carefully cloaked in polite discretion. Yet the rumor that had set the palace ablaze was different. It wasn't just gossip, it was explosive, dangerous, and if true, utterly unprecedented. It began with the birth records. No one had questioned them before. They were mundane, bureaucratic documents meant to record the passage of life, nothing more. But now, the meticulously kept pages of parchment held a question mark that no one could ignore. Questions were being asked, quietly at first, then louder. Who truly oversaw the births of the newest heirs? What had been hidden, and why? And perhaps most importantly, who, if anyone, was keeping secrets that could shake the monarchy to its foundations? Our story doesn't start with a scandal, though it will become one. It begins with a woman, a figure as elegant as she was enigmatic, as warm as she was distant. She arrived at the palace under a veil of expectations, carrying the hopes of a public who had already decided they knew her story. But the palace has a way of revealing truths that the world outside cannot see. And sometimes, those truths are not what anyone expected. Imagine for a moment being watched at every turn, every word weighed, every smile dissected. Imagine the eyes of history, the press, and a billion viewers following your every step. Not just in public, but in private moments meant only for family. Every rumor, every assumption, every whispered "what if" becomes magnified, distorted, weaponized. That is the life our protagonist has lived. And yet, beneath the surface of polished appearances, there has always been a pulse of defiance, a streak of independence that no palace walls could contain. The tension inside the palace wasn't just personal, it was political. Every secret has consequences, and the stakes here were monumental. If these rumors about the birth records were true, if the very foundation of succession had been misrepresented, then the implications were enormous. Titles, privileges, and the very perception of the monarchy were all at risk. And in a world where appearances are as powerful as law, the weight of a hidden truth can topple empires, or at least rattle them in ways that make history take notice. Our heroine, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, now faced a moment that would define her entire legacy. She had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of palace life, learning the rhythm of courtly politics, understanding the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for this. The palace itself, long a bastion of discretion, now demanded answers. And answers, she would soon learn, were not simple. What made the situation even more precarious was the nature of the question itself. It was intimate, invasive, and deeply personal. Birth records, mundane, factual, bureaucratic, suddenly became a battleground. The documents themselves were not scandalous. What they might reveal was secrets buried for decades, carefully managed narratives, and assumptions taken as truth were now poised to collide with reality. And when they did, the shockwaves would ripple far beyond the palace walls. But this is not a story of dry procedures or dusty archives. It is a story of human emotion, of fear and courage, of betrayal and loyalty. It is a story where every character carries their own agenda. Every smile may conceal a dagger, and every glance is a silent negotiation. In such a world, who can be trusted? Who is innocent? And who will ultimately be forced to confront the consequences of long-held lies? Even now, outside the palace, curiosity was mounting. The public had long been fascinated by the lives of royals, but fascination alone does not explain the obsession. There was a hunger for revelation, for drama, for the stories that the palace tried hardest to conceal. And now, the palace itself seemed ready to deliver, not through gossip, but through the inexorable pull of truth. The first threads of the investigation began subtly. Archivists noticed discrepancies, small notations, inconsistencies in dates, unexplained annotations, all pointing to something that might have been overlooked. The courtiers whispered. Some dismissed it as minor clerical error, but others, those attuned to the pulse of power, recognized it for what it was, a signal. Something hidden was coming to light, something that might change everything. And at the center of it all was our heroine. In private moments, she wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Could she speak her truth? Could she face the scrutiny of a world that expected her to be perfect, compliant, and above reproach? Could she survive the storm that was gathering, a storm not just of public opinion, but of palace machinations, media speculation, and family tension? Every decision mattered. Every word could be twisted. Every silence could be weaponized. It is here, at this juncture, that our story truly begins. The palace, centuries old and steeped in tradition, now faced a test unlike any before. It was not just about loyalty or decorum, not just about power or protocol. It was about the collision of human vulnerability with the weight of legacy. And when secrets that touch the very core of identity are exposed, the fallout is never simple. And yet, even as tension mounted and eyes turned, even as whispers swirled like a storm ready to break, there was one truth that could not be denied. This story would not end quietly. The palace, for all its grandeur and control, was about to reveal a drama that would echo through history. And at the heart of it was a woman who had lived in the glare of public attention, only now to find that some truths cannot be hidden, no matter how carefully they are guarded. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace was quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet, a stillness that, for anyone paying attention, hinted at tension coiled like a spring beneath the surface. In the private chambers, candles flickered, casting shadows that danced across the gilded walls, reflecting not just light, but the weight of centuries of expectation. Every room in the palace had a story, every corridor a secret, and tonight, the whispers of the past seemed to converge with the uncertainty of the present. She walked through the halls alone, her heels soft against the marble floors, a deliberate rhythm that masked her racing heartbeat. No one could see the doubt in her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way her pulse quickened at the thought of what was coming. The palace had been her home for years, but it never felt so unfamiliar, so threatening. Each portrait she passed seemed to stare down at her, as if judging, questioning, demanding loyalty and conformity. And yet, she had always resisted being confined by the expectations of those who came before. The day had started like any other, with carefully curated appearances, polite nods to staff, and an outward calm that concealed an inner storm. But when the first note arrived, a folded piece of parchment left unobtrusively in her private study, her world shifted. She unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, aware that each word could tip the delicate balance of her life. Records are being reviewed. Be prepared. No signature. No explanation. Just 3 words that carried a weight far beyond their simplicity. Her mind raced. Who was reviewing the records? What did they hope to find? And why now, after years of quiet compliance and carefully maintained privacy? Questions collided in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. She knew the palace well enough to understand that nothing happened by accident. A note like this was deliberate, a signal meant to unsettle, to provoke, to remind her that the machinery of power was always moving, always watching. And if the palace had started looking into the records, then there was no going back. There would be questions. There would be scrutiny. There would be consequences. Outside her chamber, the sounds of the palace continued as if nothing had changed. Footsteps echoed in the distant hallways. Doors opened and closed with polite precision. Servants carried out their duties, unaware of the storm gathering in the quietest corners of the building. But she knew better. The palace was a living entity, and tonight it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She paced the room, her mind spinning with possibilities. Could there have been a mistake in the records? A misfiled document? A clerical error? Or was it something far more deliberate, an intentional omission, a hidden truth that someone had tried to bury? Each scenario was more frightening than the last. Mistakes could be corrected, of course, but hidden truths were another matter entirely. They could destroy reputations, rewrite histories, and upend carefully constructed narratives. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She stiffened, caught off guard. Visitors at this hour were unusual, especially unannounced ones. She took a deep breath and called out, her voice steady despite the anxiety that prickled at her nerves. "Who is it?" A voice, calm but firm, responded. "A friend. Someone who can help." She hesitated. Trust was a luxury she could ill afford in a palace where loyalty was often transactional and intentions were always layered. Yet something in the tone of the voice seemed genuine. Reluctantly, she opened the door. Standing there was a figure she had not expected to see. A former confidant, someone who had once walked beside her through the labyrinth of palace life, someone who knew the secrets she had buried and the compromises she had made. Their eyes met, and in that instant, unspoken understanding passed between them. They both knew the palace was no longer just a backdrop for ceremony and tradition. It had become a stage for conflict, intrigue, and revelation. "I heard," the confidant said softly, stepping inside. "They're looking into the records." Her stomach sank. This was worse than she had imagined. The records were more than just paperwork. They were a reflection of her life, her decisions, and the intricate web of relationships that had defined her years in the palace. If these records were scrutinized, every choice she had made, every alliance she had formed, every secret she had protected could be exposed. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After all this time? That's the question, isn't it?" The confidant replied, their tone laced with concern. "Something has triggered this. Something in the palace, or outside it. And once they start, there's no stopping them." The weight of those words pressed down on her like a physical force. She realized then that she was not just navigating palace politics. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and one misstep could send her tumbling into a storm from which there would be no return. Hours passed in tense conversation. Plans were whispered, contingencies discussed, alliances reconsidered. Every possibility was weighed, every potential outcome analyzed. Yet, for all their planning, the one truth remained unchangeable. The palace had begun its investigation, and its gaze was unrelenting. As night deepened, she found herself alone once more, staring out the window at the gardens below. The moon cast pale light across the manicured lawns, illuminating paths that had been walked by generations of royalty. She imagined them all, figures from history whose lives had been dictated by the same structures, the same expectations, the same scrutiny. And she felt a kinship with them, a sense of continuity, even as she recognized the unique peril of her own moment. Her thoughts drifted to the children, the heirs whose lives would be affected by the revelations now looming. She had always believed that protecting them was paramount, yet the very records that ensured their legitimacy were now the focus of attention. She realized, with a cold clarity, that innocence offered no shield in the palace. Even the most protected could be drawn into controversy, ensnared by truths they could neither deny nor fully control. And then, in the stillness, came the sound she had been dreading, the first knock at her chamber door since the note arrived. Unlike the earlier visitor, this knock carried authority. It was not polite or hesitant. It demanded attention, commanded presence. Her pulse quickened. She knew that whoever waited outside this door represented the palace itself, not as a friend, not as a confidant, but as an institution ready to assert its power. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. There, framed by the dim light of the corridor, stood a figure she could neither dismiss nor ignore. Their expression was unreadable, their gaze steady and calculating. And in that moment, she understood that the investigation had officially begun, and that from this point forward, nothing in her life would remain untouched, unexamined, or unchallenged. "Good evening," the figure said, voice smooth, controlled, yet carrying an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. "We need to discuss the records." Her heart pounded. This was the moment she had feared and anticipated in equal measure. Every instinct screamed caution, every nerve demanded vigilance. She realized that the days ahead would be a test of endurance, intellect, and emotional resilience. The palace was no longer just a place of ceremony. It had become a labyrinth of intrigue, and she was at its center. And as the figure stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a finality that seemed almost ritualistic, She knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever secrets had been buried, whatever truths had been hidden, they would not remain so for long. But what came next would challenge everything she believed about loyalty, power, and family, and the revelations to follow would leave even the most seasoned palace insiders reeling. The morning after the first official inquiry, the palace felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller, because every hallway, every chamber, every ornate carpet seemed to press in, watching, judging, closing in like the walls themselves were conspiring. Larger, because the world beyond the palace gates had already begun to feel closer, more invasive, more aware of the tension that had been quietly building behind its doors. The palace had always been a microcosm of power, protocol, and tradition, but now, that microcosm had a fissure, and the crack ran deep. She awoke before dawn, as she often did, with the weight of anticipation pressing down on her chest. Sleep had been restless, punctuated by dreams that felt too vivid to dismiss as imagination. Shadows of courtiers, advisors, and figures from her past moved in these dreams, whispering accusations, asking questions, demanding explanations she wasn't ready to give. And always, at the center, the children, innocent, unaware, vulnerable. How could she protect them when the very records that defined their legitimacy were under scrutiny? By the time she reached her private study, the palace had already begun its quiet mobilization. Courtiers moved with the practiced precision of those who have learned that appearances matter more than truth. Documents were shuffled, notes were taken, and eyes glanced furtively at each other to confirm suspicions or exchange silent warnings. The investigation was underway, and every action, however mundane, could be interpreted as an admission, a denial, or a subtle manipulation. She sat at her desk, the same desk where she had signed invitations, letters, and ceremonial decrees for years. But today, it felt different. Today, it was a command post in a war she had not anticipated, a front line where her words, decisions, and even silences could have consequences that reverberated far beyond the palace walls. Her confidant from the previous night arrived quietly, carrying a bundle of documents, records, correspondence, and notes that might offer insight into what the palace had discovered and what it sought to uncover. They laid the papers on the desk, careful to avoid drawing attention, and both of them studied the contents with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "These are just the beginnings," the confidant said, voice low. "The palace has only skimmed the surface. What they find next could either clarify or complicate everything." She nodded, absorbing the weight of those words. Skimming the surface could reveal minor inconsistencies, trivial errors, but even minor discrepancies could be magnified into scandal. And the thought that even trivial mistakes might be weaponized against her filled her with a sense of urgency she could not ignore. Hours passed as they pored over the documents, comparing dates, annotations, and signatures. Some notes seemed innocuous. Others hinted at deliberate omissions or adjustments. She noticed patterns that made her stomach twist. Someone, at some point, had carefully curated the records, deciding what could be seen and what should remain hidden. And now, the palace's scrutiny threatened to expose choices made years ago, choices that had been necessary at the time but could now be interpreted as deceitful or worse. Even as they worked, the palace outside continued its subtle orchestration. Servants moved with impeccable timing, courtiers whispered in corners, and the ever-present gaze of tradition weighed down on every decision. Every interaction became a negotiation, every glance a potential misstep, every word a strategic move. She realized that survival required not just intelligence but emotional acuity, an ability to read intentions, detect motives, and anticipate moves before they were even made. By midday, a summons arrived, formal, terse, and unmistakably serious. She was to attend a private audience with one of the palace's senior officials, someone whose role was as much about oversight as influence. The note was curt. "We need to discuss the ongoing review of the records. Your presence is required immediately." She paused, letting the words sink in. The audience was not optional, and it was not social. It was a confrontation, one carefully orchestrated to assert authority and demand answers. She prepared herself, choosing her attire not for fashion, but for the quiet assertion of control, an armor of poise, confidence, and subtle defiance. As she walked through the palace corridors, each step echoed louder than usual, carrying with it the weight of expectation and the awareness of scrutiny. Courtiers and staff observed her passage with polite deference, but the air was charged. Even minor details, a misplaced fan, a hurried glance, could be interpreted as nervousness or guilt. The palace, she realized, was a living entity, reading her every movement, reacting to her presence, and preparing to judge her every response. In the audience chamber, the senior official waited, seated with the calm authority of someone who had seen every conceivable challenge to the palace over decades. Their expression was neutral, almost unreadable, yet the intensity of their gaze suggested a mind calculating, analyzing, and probing for weaknesses. "Thank you for coming," the official began, voice steady but edged with subtle command. "We are reviewing the records of the youngest heirs. There are questions, discrepancies, that need clarification." She swallowed, feeling the weight of the words settle in her chest. Discrepancies. Not mistakes. Not oversights. Discrepancies. The term implied intent, calculation, perhaps even deception. She kept her expression calm, her posture composed, but inside, a storm was building. "What kind of discrepancies?" she asked, her voice measured but curious. The official handed her a folder. Inside were highlighted entries, annotations, and dates that suggested inconsistencies. Some could be innocent, clerical errors, misinterpretations, but others hinted at decisions made deliberately, records adjusted or omitted for reasons she had only understood privately. "These," the official said, pointing to a series of notes, "require your explanation. Why were these details recorded this way? Who authorized the changes? And what was the rationale behind them?" The questions, though framed politely, carried unspoken consequences. Every answer, every hesitation, every explanation would be scrutinized, dissected, and remembered. The investigation was not just about documents. It was about narrative, perception, and the alignment of truth with the palace's expectations. She began to respond, choosing her words with meticulous care. She recounted the decisions made at the time, the necessity behind each action, the considerations that guided her. Yet, even as she spoke, she knew that explanation alone might not suffice. The palace demanded clarity, absolutes, and sometimes, the truth alone was not enough. After what felt like hours, the official nodded. "We will review your statements. Further inquiries may follow." She left the chamber with a sense of cautious relief, but also a deepening unease. The investigation had officially escalated. The palace's attention was not casual, not fleeting, and not forgiving. Every decision she had made, every secret she had protected, and every relationship she had navigated was now under the microscope. Back in her private study, she sank into a chair, exhausted yet alert. The weight of the day pressed on her shoulders, yet a fire burned within. She knew that she could not simply wait for the palace to dictate the narrative. She had to act, to anticipate, to strategize, not only for herself, but for those she sought to protect. Her confidant returned, bearing tea and an assortment of notes compiled during the day. Together, they reviewed the next steps, mapping potential scenarios, weighing the risks, and identifying allies and obstacles. The stakes were clear. One misstep could unravel not just her position, but the carefully maintained stability of the household, the heirs, and the perception of the palace itself. As night fell, the palace settled into a deceptive calm once more. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across ornate walls and polished floors. The corridors were silent, but beneath the quiet, the machinery of investigation hummed with unyielding precision. Documents were scrutinized, conversations were analyzed, and every nuance of behavior was noted. The palace had begun to operate on multiple levels, formal, informal, visible, invisible, and she was at the center of its attention. Alone at her desk, she opened a small, hidden drawer. A private repository of letters, notes, and personal reflections she had maintained for years. She reviewed them carefully, seeking insights, corroboration, or evidence that might support her position. Each note reminded her of the choices she had made, the compromises she had accepted, and the loyalties she had honored. And yet, even in this private space, a shadow of doubt lingered. How much of her own story could withstand scrutiny? How much of it could survive the relentless gaze of tradition, protocol, and expectation? A sudden knock at the door startled her. It was neither polite nor formal, it was urgent. A message had arrived, delivered discreetly by a trusted aide. The contents were brief but loaded. New information has surfaced. You must see it immediately. She realized then that the palace investigation was accelerating, and that every day, every hour, could bring revelations that might alter the course of her life, the perception of the heirs, and the stability of the household itself. The stakes had escalated beyond her calculations, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, tension, and peril. And as she stepped toward the corridor, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. She understood one undeniable truth. The palace was no longer just a place of ceremony and tradition. It was a battlefield. Every move, every word, every glance could tip the balance. And in this game, only those who could navigate the intricate web of secrecy, loyalty, and strategy would survive. But what came next would reveal layers of intrigue, deception, and revelation that no one, neither insider nor observer, could have anticipated. The palace gardens, usually serene in the early morning light, felt like a stage set for secrets rather than a place of beauty. Dew clung to the manicured lawns, glinting in the soft sunlight, while fountains whispered their constant, rhythmic songs. But she hardly noticed the elegance or calm. Her mind was consumed with the consequences of yesterday's confrontation. Every corner of the palace seemed to hum with unspoken tension, every rustle of leaves a reminder that the investigation had officially reached her doorstep. She moved through the corridors in silence, her footsteps measured, yet her pulse betrayed the urgency she felt. Every glance she caught from a passing staff member, every door that opened too quickly, every shadow that shifted unexpectedly seemed loaded with meaning. The palace was alive, in a way few outside its walls could ever comprehend, and it was watching her. When she reached her private study, she found it untouched from the previous night, papers neatly stacked, chairs in place. But the sense of waiting in the air was palpable. The confidant from the day before was already there, organizing folders and reviewing notes with meticulous care. Their expression, usually calm and reassuring, now betrayed the tension that ran through the household. "They've started contacting people outside the immediate staff," the confidant said, barely above a whisper. "Historians, clerks, even distant relatives. They want to see if any additional information surfaces. It's extensive." Her chest tightened. The reach of the investigation was expanding faster than she had anticipated. The palace was no longer satisfied with internal documents alone. It was seeking corroboration, testimony, and context. Anything that could clarify or complicate the narrative. And in doing so, it risked dragging not only her, but countless others into a web of scrutiny and speculation. She nodded, absorbing the information, then turned to the desk to retrieve the folder she had reviewed the night before. Inside were the records, highlighted sections, and annotations, the discrepancies the senior official had questioned. She traced her fingers over the ink, each mark a reminder of decisions made long ago, decisions that had seemed prudent at the time, but now carried the potential for misinterpretation. "Do you think they suspect intent?" she asked, her voice low and tense. The confidant looked up, eyes sharp. "They always suspect intent. That's how the palace operates. A clerical error is never just a clerical error. An omission is never just an oversight. Everything is considered, evaluated, and weighed. Always." The words resonated with her. She had learned long ago that appearances, not truth, often dictated outcomes. A carefully crafted explanation could be dismissed. A hesitant glance could be construed as guilt. Every moment within these walls required vigilance, foresight, and an almost preternatural understanding of human motives. Suddenly, a soft knock at the door interrupted their discussion. The confidant signaled her to remain seated while they opened it cautiously. A messenger stepped inside, delivering a small envelope with a discreet bow. No words were exchanged. The tension in the room thickened as the confidant handed her the envelope. She slit the seal with trembling fingers and withdrew a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was formal, precise, and unmistakable. It contained a brief message. Meet us at the East Wing Archives at midday. There are documents you must see before anyone else does. Her mind raced. The East Wing Archives were rarely accessed by anyone outside of senior officials. This meeting was not casual. It was deliberate. It was urgent. And it carried with it the unmistakable scent of secrets poised to be revealed. Should we go? The confidant asked, noting her hesitation. Yes, she replied, standing abruptly. But we proceed carefully. Every step, every movement, someone is watching. And we cannot be seen. By midday, they made their way to the East Wing, moving with quiet determination through a series of hallways that felt unusually empty, almost eerie in their stillness. The palace, normally bustling with activity, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something consequential was about to unfold. The archive's door loomed ahead, imposing and unyielding. With a soft click, it opened, revealing rows upon rows of meticulously catalogued documents. Shelves stretched higher than her gaze could reach, filled with centuries of records, correspondence, and private notes. It was a treasure trove of history, and now a potential source of answers or new complications. Here, the confidant whispered, pointing to a stack of documents on a side table. These are the ones they want you to see first. She approached, carefully picking up the top folder. Inside were records spanning years, detailing not just events within the palace, but decisions that touched on lives, legacies, and the youngest heirs. She skimmed through, eyes widening at certain entries. Dates were misaligned, annotations hinted at deliberate edits, and a few documents bore signatures she didn't recognize, signatures that suggested involvement from individuals long thought removed from direct influence. Her mind raced. The implications were staggering. The records did not merely recount events. They revealed an intricate web of decisions, manipulations, and concealments. Someone had curated these details carefully, shaping narratives in ways that had gone unnoticed until now. This goes beyond clerical error, she murmured, barely able to process the significance. This is calculated. Someone intended for certain truths to remain hidden. The confidant nodded gravely. And now, the palace is uncovering them. Every choice, every omission, every adjustment is under scrutiny. They want clarity, and they will not accept half-truths. She sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had discovered. The palace was not just reviewing history, it was interrogating it. And in doing so, it was interrogating her, her actions, and the very foundation of the household she had worked to protect. Hours passed as they examined the documents in painstaking detail. Patterns emerged, connections became clearer, and the scale of the situation began to crystallize. The palace's investigation was not merely about accuracy, it was about accountability. And the accountability it demanded could reshape not only her life, but the lives of those she held dear. As dusk approached, they prepared to leave the archives, their minds heavy with implications. The corridors outside were still, shadows stretching long across the polished floors. It felt as though the palace itself was aware of the revelations, watching, waiting to see what their next move would be. And then, just as they reached the main hall, a message arrived, hand-delivered, sealed, and unmistakably urgent. She opened it with a sense of foreboding, reading the single line inside. Someone within the palace is not who they appear to be. Trust no one. The next disclosure will change everything. Her heart pounded. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a warning. Layers of intrigue, betrayal, and danger were converging, and she could no longer rely on familiar routines, trusted confidants, or assumptions about loyalty. Every decision, every interaction, every move would carry weight. The palace had become a labyrinth, and she was at its center. The game had escalated, and the stakes were higher than ever. But what came next would reveal hidden alliances, secret motives, and truths that even the closest insiders could not have anticipated, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the palace walls. The evening air carried a chill as she made her way back to her private chambers, the palace corridors stretching endlessly before her. Every footstep seemed amplified, echoing off walls lined with centuries of history, portraits of long-dead monarchs, and tapestries that had witnessed secrets far older than her own. Tonight, however, the weight of history was not comforting, it was suffocating. The palace felt alive, and it was watching her. The envelope delivered earlier still burned in her thoughts. Someone within the palace is not who they appear to be. Trust no one. The next disclosure will change everything. Those words had rattled her more than any confrontation, more than any inquiry, more than the scrutiny of the documents themselves. The palace, she realized, was no longer merely a place of tradition and ceremony. It had become a stage for intrigue, deception, and revelation. She entered her chambers and closed the door with deliberate care, leaning against it for a long moment. The flickering candlelight painted shadows across her face, exaggerating the tension etched into her features. The palace had always demanded composure, but tonight, even composure felt like a fragile veneer, easily shattered. Her confidant appeared shortly after, moving silently through the room as though aware that even the slightest noise could carry consequences. "We need to talk," they said softly, laying a small stack of papers on the desk. She nodded, sitting down heavily. "I received a warning," she admitted. "Someone inside is hiding something. And whatever is coming next, it's going to change everything." The confidant's expression darkened. "That's what worries me. The palace has layers, alliances, and hidden agendas. For every person who seems loyal, there's another whose intentions are opaque. We have to anticipate every possibility." They pored over the documents together, analyzing dates, signatures, and notes that hinted at concealed decisions. Patterns emerged that suggested deliberate manipulation. Carefully curated narratives, selective omissions, and subtle alterations that might have gone unnoticed if not for the palace's current scrutiny. Someone had shaped the records, and someone had relied on those records to maintain a specific story. Now, that story was unraveling. Her mind wandered to the children, the heirs whose lives were intertwined with these very records. Innocent, unaware, and yet poised to be affected by decisions and secrets they could not comprehend. She realized that protecting them was not simply a matter of physical care, but of safeguarding the narrative itself. Every revelation, every misstep, could cast a shadow over their legitimacy, their future, and the perception of their place within the palace. A sudden knock at the door startled her. Even in her heightened state of alert, the sound was sharp, urgent. The confidant motioned for her to stay seated as they opened the door. A messenger entered, bowing slightly, and handed her a sealed note. Without words, they retreated, leaving her to face whatever message awaited. Breaking the seal, she read the single line inside. "Meet in the private library. You are not alone in this." Her pulse quickened. The private library was rarely used except for the most sensitive discussions, often reserved for confidential meetings between senior officials. The invitation, or summons, was deliberate. It implied knowledge, collaboration, and the potential for revelation. She turned to her confidant. "We go? But carefully. Every step, every word, every glance, someone will notice." By the time they reached the library, the palace had taken on an unusual quiet. The usual bustle of staff and courtiers was absent, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Inside the library, the atmosphere was tense, almost reverent. Shelves lined with leather-bound tomes towered above them, the scent of aged paper mingling with polished wood. A figure emerged from the shadows, a senior archivist, someone known for meticulous work and discretion. Their eyes were sharp, assessing, as they gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming," they said quietly. "What you are about to see has not been reviewed by anyone else outside of this room." They handed her a folder, its contents revealing new layers of complexity. Notes, annotations, and letters suggested that decisions regarding the youngest heirs had been influenced not only by administrative necessity, but also by personal agendas. Names appeared that she did not recognize, some crossed out and replaced, others noted in ways that implied secrecy or selective disclosure. She scanned the documents, each page increasing the tension in her chest. The evidence suggested deliberate shaping of the narrative, and yet, nothing conclusively pointed to motive. Who had orchestrated these alterations? Why now? And how deep did the network of secrecy run? "The palace," the archivist said softly, "has only just begun to untangle this web. Whoever is responsible, inside or outside the official channels, has left traces that are subtle but telling. And those traces are starting to emerge. Her mind raced. She realized that she was not just dealing with a straightforward investigation. She was navigating a complex network of hidden alliances, unspoken rivalries, and calculated manipulations. Every familiar face in the palace could harbor intentions unknown, and every casual observation could conceal layers of strategy. Hours passed as they examined the documents, tracing connections, highlighting inconsistencies, and mapping potential lines of influence. The archivist offered insights, but their cautious tone implied that even they did not have the full picture. The puzzle was vast, intricate, and evolving in real time. As twilight fell, she felt the growing pressure of the palace's gaze. Even within the sanctuary of the library, she could sense the presence of observation. Unseen eyes, listening ears, the subtle movement of those tasked with monitoring, recording, and reporting. The palace itself had become a character in this unfolding drama, with its own intentions, rhythms, and methods of influence. Finally, the archivist spoke again, their voice cutting through the tension. You must understand, the information here is only part of a larger picture. Decisions were made with knowledge we may not yet possess. But one thing is certain, the next phase will be decisive. You must prepare. She left the library with a sense of urgency that bordered on dread. The corridors felt narrower, the portraits on the walls more imposing, the shadows more menacing. She realized that the investigation was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and relentless. The palace was moving, and she had to keep pace, anticipate its next steps, and navigate the web of intrigue that had suddenly ensnared her life. Returning to her chambers, she reflected on the day's revelations. Every layer of the palace she thought she knew had been peeled back to reveal hidden depths, unknown actors, and potential threats. She understood now that the investigation was more than a review of records. It was a test of resilience, strategy, and emotional acuity. And as she prepared for the night, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The palace, with all its grandeur and tradition, had revealed itself as a labyrinth of secrets, power, and hidden intentions. Navigating it required more than courage. It required insight, vigilance, and a readiness to confront truths that could not be ignored. But what came next would expose betrayals and alliances she never anticipated, and the consequences would reach beyond her, touching the lives of everyone connected to the palace in ways that would leave history forever altered. The dawn broke slowly over the palace, spilling pale light through the high windows of her chambers. The morning should have felt serene, a gentle beginning to another day steeped in tradition, but serenity had been banished long ago. Every sound, the distant clatter of a servant's routine, the soft rustle of papers being shuffled, even the faint hum of activity in the corridors, seemed charged with meaning. The palace was awake, alert, and, she feared, watching her every move. She rose and moved to the window, staring out across the gardens. The fountains glimmered with droplets like scattered diamonds, and the carefully trimmed hedges cast long shadows that shifted with the wind. It should have been calming, a brief reminder that beauty could still exist amidst tension. Instead, it only sharpened her awareness that she was trapped in a world of appearances and secrets, where the line between friend and foe could be as thin as a whisper. Her confidant arrived without announcement, placing a cup of tea on her desk. The gesture was familiar, comforting, yet carried a subtle reminder of the stakes. In this palace, even comfort was provisional. Every act had to be considered, every intention weighed. They've expanded the review, the confidant said softly. Not just the records in the archives, but correspondence, private notes, even informal communications. Anything remotely relevant. Her stomach tightened. The palace had turned the entire household into a web of scrutiny. What had begun as a procedural inquiry had now become an exhaustive audit, tracing decisions, relationships, and hidden actions with painstaking precision. She realized that the investigation was no longer simply administrative, it was existential. She spread the newly delivered documents across her desk, carefully arranging them to understand connections and sequences. Letters between officials hinted at long-standing tensions, subtle disagreements, and, In some cases, attempts to influence narratives to suit particular outcomes. What initially appeared as routine correspondence now carried layers of implication, evidence of underlying motives, and potential points of vulnerability. "It's like a chessboard," she murmured, tracing lines between names and dates. "Every move, every correspondence, every decision is a piece. And someone is orchestrating the game with remarkable foresight." The confidant nodded. "Exactly. And we need to anticipate the next moves, or we risk being outmaneuvered." Hours passed as they worked methodically, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and annotations. Every discovery seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who had influenced certain decisions? Why had certain details been highlighted, altered, or omitted? And who else within the palace might be aware of these manipulations? The answers were elusive, but the implications were unmistakable. Someone had been carefully shaping the narrative for years, and the palace's current investigation was poised to uncover the truth. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor, a courier, dressed in the muted tones of the palace service, carrying a sealed letter with no sender's name. She took it cautiously, recognizing the signature seal as one used only by the senior official who had first initiated the inquiry. She opened it slowly, bracing herself. The letter read simply, "A meeting has been arranged. Attendance is mandatory. Evidence must be reviewed before the council convenes. Discretion is required." Her pulse quickened. The council, the inner circle of decision-makers, was the arena where judgments were rendered, reputations were shaped, and consequences were enforced. Being summoned was both an honor and a threat. Every word she would speak, every explanation she would offer, would be dissected and scrutinized. "Prepare," she told her confidant. "We need to anticipate questions, responses, and counterarguments. Every possibility." The journey to the council chamber was tense. Every corridor seemed longer than usual, every shadow darker, and every echo more pronounced. Courtiers and staff moved as if performing an elaborate dance, their movements precise and practiced, yet carrying the undercurrent of tension she had come to recognize. The palace itself seemed aware of the impending confrontation, as though every stone and tapestry could sense the gravity of the moment. The council chamber was imposing. High ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and walls lined with centuries-old portraits created a sense of history and authority. At the center sat the council members, their expressions unreadable, their eyes calculating. Each movement, each glance, each subtle gesture seemed imbued with the potential to shift the balance of perception. "Thank you for attending," the senior official said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We have reviewed the initial records and correspondence. What follows will require complete transparency and careful explanation." She nodded, steadying herself. Every instinct, every memory, every decision of her past few years had led to this moment. She began her account, detailing the decisions she had made regarding the household, the heirs, and the management of records. She explained the rationale, the context, and the reasoning behind every choice, striving for clarity, precision, and honesty. Yet, even as she spoke, she could sense the council weighing not just the facts, but the implications. What was said, what was omitted, and what was interpreted all carried significance. Her words were not merely information, they were strategy, diplomacy, and, in some ways, survival. Hours passed in tense deliberation. Questions were pointed, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, each probing the integrity, judgment, and loyalty of her decisions. She answered with care, aware that any misstep could be magnified, misrepresented, or misunderstood. When the session concluded, she left the chamber with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The council had listened, questioned, and considered, but their judgment remained pending. The investigation was far from over, and she knew that the unfolding scrutiny would continue to challenge her at every turn. Returning to her chambers, she reflected on the day's events. Every layer of palace life she had thought she understood had been peeled back to reveal a network of influence, hidden motives, and subtle manipulations. She understood now that navigating the palace required not just intelligence and poise, but a capacity for resilience, adaptability, and strategic foresight. Even as she prepared for the night, a sense of unease lingered. The palace, with all its grandeur and tradition, had revealed itself as a labyrinth of secrets, power plays, and potential betrayal. Each day, each revelation, and each decision could alter not just her path, but the lives of those she sought to protect. A sudden knock at the door interrupted her reflection. A courier delivered a small package, unmarked but unmistakably formal. Inside, she found additional documents, letters, annotations, and notes that further complicated the emerging narrative. Whoever had prepared them had anticipated the investigation's trajectory, and the contents suggested that new alliances, hidden motives, and unspoken agendas were about to be exposed. She realized then that the palace was no longer merely an institution of tradition. It had become a theater of intrigue. Every corridor, every chamber, every interaction carried weight, influence, and consequence. And she, once a passive participant in its rhythms, was now at the center of a storm whose intensity she could neither predict nor control. But what came next would bring revelations that would not only test her resilience, but challenge her understanding of loyalty, truth, and power, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. The palace was unusually still that evening, as if aware that another revelation loomed on the horizon. Even the corridors seemed to stretch farther than usual, the high ceilings amplifying the echoes of footsteps and hushed conversations. She moved carefully, acutely aware that every sound she made could be noticed, interpreted, or reported. The palace had become a living organism, each creaking floorboard, every shadow, a subtle reminder that she was no longer simply a resident but a subject under scrutiny. Her chambers offered little solace. Papers, notes, and documents cluttered the desk, each one a thread in a web of decisions, edits, and secrets that had accumulated over the years. Some were mundane, others carried subtle hints of manipulation or omission, and all had the potential to reveal truths that had been meticulously concealed. She sat for a long moment, staring at the stack, trying to untangle the implications, wondering how much she could control in a palace where control was largely an illusion. Her confidant entered silently, placing a small envelope on the desk. Its seal was unfamiliar, marked with a symbol used sparingly for matters of utmost importance. She recognized immediately that this was not casual correspondence. It was a summons, a signal that the next stage of the investigation was about to unfold. She broke the seal, revealing a single line of text. Meet in the hidden annex. Evidence awaits that has never been revealed. Prepare for decisions that will shape the future. Her pulse quickened. The hidden annex was known to only a select few, an area rarely accessed, reserved for confidential matters involving the most sensitive decisions in the palace. Whoever had summoned her clearly wanted privacy, but also carried an implicit warning. What she was about to see would be consequential. "Are we certain about this?" she asked her confidant, her voice low. "There's no choice," the confidant replied. "Once the investigation escalates, information comes at you fast. You need to see this before the palace decides on the next steps." They moved through the corridors with deliberate caution, navigating the familiar, yet now ominous pathways of the palace. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the candlelight, flickering across the walls in a way that made every corner seem alive, every alcove a potential hiding place for secrets waiting to be revealed. The hidden annex was at the far end of the east wing, accessible only through a series of doors and passages designed to obscure access. As they entered, the atmosphere shifted. The annex was small, lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with ancient manuscripts, rare documents, and meticulously kept records. The air smelled of aged paper, wood polish, and something faintly metallic, an aroma that spoke of secrets and history intertwined. At the center of the room, a figure waited, partially obscured by shadows, holding a folder that seemed impossibly thick with the weight of untold information. "Thank you for coming," the figure said, voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "What you are about to see has never been reviewed outside this room." She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the figure for any sign of deceit or intention. The folder was placed on a central table, and as she lifted the cover, a collection of documents spilled into view. Letters, annotations, birth records, correspondence with officials, and even personal notes that had never been part of the official archives. Some bore signatures she recognized, others were cryptic, and a few carried marks she had never seen before. Her heart raced as she realized the magnitude of the information before her. These were not mere records. They were fragments of a carefully curated history, layers of decisions and omissions that could, if revealed, shift perceptions of loyalty, legitimacy, and truth. This, the figure said, gesturing to specific documents, is the heart of the matter. Decisions were made years ago that influenced the way the records were maintained. Some were necessary, others questionable, but all were intentional. She traced her fingers over the pages, absorbing details that were both familiar and alarming. Dates had been altered, annotations added or erased, and certain entries highlighted while others were left vague. The pattern was deliberate, calculated, and clearly designed to preserve a specific narrative, one that now faced exposure under the palace's ongoing investigation. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice tense. "Who shaped these records?" The figure's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "That is what the palace is trying to determine. But the evidence points to multiple actors, some of whom are still within the household. Alliances were formed, decisions were influenced, and secrets were carefully maintained. Until now." Her mind reeled. The implications were staggering. This was no longer just an inquiry into administrative procedures. It was an exploration of influence, manipulation, and hidden agendas. Every actor in this unfolding drama could be affected. The palace, herself, the children, and countless others whose lives intersected with these decisions. Hours passed as they reviewed the documents, tracing connections, highlighting inconsistencies, and noting patterns that suggested deliberate oversight or concealment. Each discovery added complexity to an already intricate web, revealing layers of influence she had never fully comprehended. It became clear that the palace's current scrutiny was only the beginning, and that the consequences of what they were uncovering would ripple far beyond her immediate environment. By late evening, they had compiled a preliminary assessment of the findings. Some records could be explained by necessity, others required careful contextualization, and a few raised questions that could not be ignored. She realized that the next steps would demand not only clarity and transparency, but strategic thinking and an ability to anticipate every possible interpretation. As they prepared to leave the annex, the figure spoke one final warning. "What you have seen tonight changes everything. The palace is watching, the council is deliberating, and decisions are imminent. You must be ready for questions that go beyond the documents themselves. Questions about loyalty, judgment, and truth." She nodded, understanding fully the gravity of the situation. The palace had transformed from a place of tradition and ceremony into a theater of scrutiny, influence, and revelation. Every corridor, every chamber, every interaction carried weight and consequence. And she, once a participant in the rhythms of courtly life, was now at the center of a storm that would test her resilience, intelligence, and ability to navigate a labyrinth of secrecy and power. Returning to her chambers, she reflected on the events of the day. Every layer of the palace she had taken for granted had been revealed to be more intricate, more politically charged, and more dangerous than she had imagined. She realized that survival required more than composure. It required foresight, vigilance, and the capacity to anticipate moves before they were made. And as night fell over the palace, shadows stretching across corridors and gardens alike, she understood one undeniable truth. The investigation was only beginning. Hidden motives, undisclosed alliances, and carefully maintained secrets were poised to emerge, and the consequences would challenge everything she had believed about loyalty, family, and the very structure of the palace itself. But what came next would unveil truths that no one, not even the closest confidants, could have foreseen, and the revelations would leave the palace forever altered. The night was heavy over the palace, thick with silence that felt almost unnatural. Every room, corridor, and chamber seemed to pulse with the anticipation of secrets yet to be revealed. Outside, the moonlight reflected off the polished stone, creating elongated shadows that crawled across the gardens and corridors. She moved through these shadows, each step measured, her senses heightened. The palace was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, observing, evaluating, and, in some subtle way, influencing the unfolding drama. Her chambers had become a command center of sorts, a private space where she could confront the reality of the investigation and strategize. Papers and folders littered the desk, evidence from the archives, and the hidden annex spread out in careful order. Notes were highlighted, cross-references made, timelines constructed, and potential scenarios mapped. Every detail mattered. Every omission, no matter how minor, could become a point of contention. Her confidant entered silently, a habitual presence that had become both reassuring and necessary. They moved to the desk, scanning the growing mountain of information. "The palace is moving faster than expected," they said quietly. "They're already circulating preliminary findings, and the next step will likely involve questioning those outside the immediate household." Her pulse quickened. The investigation had already expanded beyond the confines of the palace. Now, even peripheral figures, extended relatives, former staff, associates, might be drawn in. Every connection she had, every decision she had made, could be analyzed, dissected, and potentially misrepresented. The stakes were higher than ever. She spread her hands over the documents, letting her gaze sweep across the names, dates, and annotations. Some entries were straightforward, easily explained, and aligned with administrative necessity. Others were ambiguous, carefully phrased, and hinted at intentional omission. The patterns were deliberate, almost surgical in their precision. Whoever had curated these records had done so with care, understanding the importance of shaping perception and controlling narrative. Hours passed in tense deliberation. Each new document raised questions. Why had a date been altered? Why had a note been erased or replaced? Who had authorized these changes, and what were their motives? It became increasingly clear that the palace was not merely seeking facts. It was seeking accountability, intent, and the subtle truths hidden between the lines of the records. Mid-morning brought a messenger, delivering a sealed envelope marked with the palace insignia. She opened it with cautious anticipation. The note inside was succinct. "An urgent meeting has been scheduled. Attendance is required at the council chamber. Bring all relevant documents. Discretion is paramount."